On a rainy night, Melanie Jackson, an investigative journalist known for her relentless pursuit of justice, finds herself pulled into a dangerous confrontation with those she seeks to expose. As she navigates the dark, empty streets of the city, she becomes acutely aware of being followed by a shadowy figure. What begins as a routine meeting with a source quickly spirals into a tense encounter with corrupt officers determined to silence her at any cost. Melanie's calm demeanor and sharp wit are met with hostility and threats, but she refuses to back down. Only after the stakes escalate and a dramatic twist unfolds does the truth behind their intentions come to light. As Melanie stands her ground, she exposes not only the corruption of the officers, but the entire system they represent. What happens next is both shocking and inspiring, a reminder of the power of truth and the courage it takes to stand up against those who abuse their authority. If you aren't subscribed yet, I highly recommend subscribing and hitting the bell icon, so you don't miss any of our powerful stories that challenge injustice and uplift the voices of those who refuse to stay silent. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the city into a maze of slick streets and fogged windows. Melanie Jackson tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the dark leather. The rhythmic thud of the wipers did little to clear her vision as she navigated through the labyrinth of downtown. The familiar roads, now almost unrecognizable in the storm's fury. Melanie was no stranger to the city's pulse. As a seasoned journalist, she had spent years unraveling its secrets, exposing the rot beneath its polished surface. But tonight, something felt different. A heavy weight in the air, a tension that pressed against her chest with every breath. It wasn't just the weather, it was the story she was chasing, the one that had kept her up for nights on end, poring over documents, interviewing witnesses, connecting dots that led to places she wished didn't exist. Her latest investigation had taken her deep into the heart of the police department, where corruption festered like an open wound. She had heard the stories before, whispers of brutality, racism, and a code of silence that protected those who wore the badge. But this time, the stories had names, faces, and a trail of evidence that pointed directly to Officer Brian O'Connor, a man whose reputation for violence was as notorious as the badge he wore. Brian O'Connor was everything she had feared, a hardliner with a disdain for the people he was supposed to protect, particularly those who looked like her. Melanie had grown up in a world where the color of her skin was both her pride and her curse, where every step she took was measured against the expectations of a society that saw her as less. She had fought to carve out a space where her voice could be heard, but even now, the echoes of that struggle lingered in the back of her mind. As she turned onto a narrow street, her phone buzzed on the dashboard. A text message from her editor, Jamal, flashed across the screen. "Be careful out there. O'Connor's not the kind to back down easily." Melanie sighed, her breath fogging up the windshield. Jamal had been her rock through this investigation, providing the support she needed to keep going, even when the risks became all too real. She texted back a quick reply. "I'm almost there. Got a bad feeling about tonight, though." She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her gut. Melanie had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her to turn back, to abandon the story, to walk away before it was too late. But she couldn't. Too many people had already paid the price for silence. She wouldn't add her name to that list. The streets grew quieter as she approached the meeting spot, a small diner on the edge of town, far from the bustling center, where she was supposed to meet a source who had promised to give her the final piece of the puzzle. This was the key, the one thing that could bring down O'Connor and the corrupt system that protected him. But as she parked her car and looked out into the rain-soaked night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Melanie pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped out of the car, the cold rain instantly soaking through the fabric. The diner's neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of unease persisted, gnawing at her as she walked toward the entrance. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of late-night patrons hunched over their coffee cups. The waitress behind the counter gave her a tired smile as Melanie took a seat at a booth near the back, her eyes on the door. She ordered a coffee, though she had no intention of drinking it. Her mind was too focused on what was to come. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The source was late, and Melanie's nerves were starting to fray. She pulled out her phone, checking for any missed calls or messages. But there was nothing. Just as she was about to text Jamal again, the door to the diner opened, and a man stepped inside. Melanie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. Darius, one of the few people brave enough to come forward with information about O'Connor. He looked around nervously before spotting her and making his way to the booth. His clothes were drenched and his face was pale, but there was a determined set to his jaw that told her he was ready to talk. "Thanks for coming," Melanie said as he slid into the seat across from her. Darius nodded, glancing around the diner as if expecting someone to jump out at him. "I almost didn't," he admitted, his voice low and shaky. "But then I thought about what he did to me, to my brother. I couldn't just let that slide." Melanie leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. "What do you have for me, Darius? You said you had proof." He nodded again, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small flash drive. "It's all on here. Recordings, documents, everything you need to take him down." She reached for the drive, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," she said, trying to mask the excitement in her voice. But as she looked into Darius's eyes, she saw the fear that lingered there, the fear that had driven so many others to silence. "Melanie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to be careful. O'Connor, he's dangerous, and he's got people watching you. I've seen them outside your place, following you." Her stomach twisted at his words, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I know the risks, Darius, but I can't stop now. We're too close." He hesitated, then nodded, as if resigned to the fact that there was no turning back. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Melanie gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I will. And thank you, Darius. You've done something really brave here." He looked down at his hands, his expression conflicted. "I just hope it's worth it," he muttered. Before she could respond, the door to the diner swung open again, and this time, Melanie felt a chill run down her spine. 3 men walked in, their eyes immediately locking onto her. They were dressed in plain clothes, but there was no mistaking who they were. O'Connor's men. Darius noticed them too, and his face drained of color. "Melanie, we need to get out of here." But it was too late. The men approached the booth, blocking their exit. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "You've been digging where you shouldn't, Miss Jackson." Melanie's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show fear. "I'm a journalist. It's my job to dig," the man sneered, his breath hot against her skin. "Not this time. You're going to hand over whatever you've got on O'Connor, and you're going to forget this ever happened, or we're going to make you regret ever sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Melanie swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't let them have the flash drive, but she also knew they weren't bluffing. Darius was shaking beside her, his eyes wide with fear. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Jamal. He had followed her, just in case things went south. And now, as the men loomed over her, she saw him subtly raise his phone, recording everything. Relief washed over her, but she knew they weren't out of danger yet. "You really think you can scare me into silence?" she said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "You're going to have to do better than that." The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Melanie thought he might actually strike her. But then he caught sight of Jamal, his eyes widening as he realized they were being recorded. He swore under his breath, backing off slightly. "This isn't over, Jackson," he spat, before turning on his heel and storming out of the diner, his men following close behind. As soon as they were gone, Darius let out a shaky breath, slumping back in his seat. "That was too close," he muttered, running a hand over his face. Melanie exhaled, finally allowing herself to relax. Jamal hurried over to the booth, his face etched with concern. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for any sign of distress. She nodded, holding up the flash drive. "We got what we came for." Jamal glanced toward the door, then back at her. "You sure you want to keep going with this? It's getting dangerous, Mel." She looked down at the drive in her hand, then back up at him, her eyes burning with determination. "I've come too far to back down now. It's time to bring the truth to light." The next morning, the city was buzzing. News of the altercation at the diner had spread like wildfire, especially after Jamal's video had been uploaded to the newspaper's website and social media channels. Comments flooded in from people outraged by the intimidation tactics used against Melanie and Darius. Many commended Melanie for her bravery, but the backlash from those defending the police was equally strong. Melanie could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of fear, excitement, and uncertainty. As she walked into the newsroom, heads turned, eyes filled with a mix of admiration and concern. Her editor, Jamal, was already waiting for her, his expression grim. "Mel, we need to talk," he said, motioning her to follow him into his office. She closed the door behind her and took a seat, bracing herself for what was coming. "I know what you're going to say, Jamal," she started, but he cut her off. "No, I don't think you do," he said, his voice tense. "You're a target now, Mel. O'Connor and his men aren't just going to let this slide. That stunt last night, it put a spotlight on them, and they're going to come after you with everything they've got." Melanie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And that's exactly why we can't stop. We've got the proof now. This is bigger than just O'Connor. It's the whole system that's been protecting him, and others like him." Jamal sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, and I'm with you on this, but we need to be smart. We can't afford to make any mistakes. The stakes are too high." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I've already set up interviews with a few more people who've been victims of O'Connor's abuse. If we can get them on record, we'll have a stronger case." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "You really think they'll talk, especially after what happened last night? They're scared, but they're also fed up. If we can give them a platform, show them that their voices matter, I think they will," Melanie replied, her voice firm with conviction. Jamal watched her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we're doubling down on security. I'm not taking any chances with you out there, and we need to be ready for legal blowback. They're going to try and bury us in lawsuits. You know that, right?" "Let them try," Melanie said. "The truth will stand." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Melanie met with more victims, men and women who had been silenced for too long. Each story was a painful reminder of the systemic abuse that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. An elderly man, his hands trembling, recounted how his grandson had been falsely accused and beaten by O'Connor for merely being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A single mother spoke of her teenage son, who had been brutalized and humiliated for resisting arrest, when all he did was ask why he was being detained. Melanie documented every word, every tear, and every haunting silence that spoke louder than any testimony. She knew these were more than just stories. They were the voices of a community that had been pushed to the brink. But with every new interview, the threats became more frequent and more direct. Her phone buzzed constantly with unknown numbers, the messages ranging from warnings to outright death threats. "Back off or else," one read. Another was more explicit. "You won't make it to the end of the week." Melanie's hands would shake sometimes, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of carrying the weight of these stories and the ever-present danger looming over her. She had always known the risks of her job, but this was different. This felt like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to unleash its fury. One evening, after a particularly intense interview, she sat in her car, staring blankly at the dashboard. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her with a bone-deep weariness. She thought of her parents, how they had raised her to stand up against injustice, how proud they were of her work, and how terrified they would be if they knew just how deep she was in. As she rested her head against the steering wheel, her phone rang. It was Jamal. "Hey, Mel. You need to get back to the office. Now." There was something in his voice, a tension that sent a shiver down her spine. "What's going on?" "We just got a tip. O'Connor's looking for you, and he's not alone." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. "I'm on my way," she said, starting the car. She hung up and drove back to the office, her mind racing. She knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. When she arrived, Jamal was waiting for her outside, along with a few of their colleagues. The air was thick with tension. "They're parked down the street," he said, nodding toward a dark SUV barely visible in the fading light. "Are they watching us?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear curling in her stomach. "Probably. We've called the lawyer and are prepping for the worst," Jamal replied. "But I need you to be sure, Mel. Are you ready for this? Because if we go forward, there's no going back." Melanie looked at the SUV, her eyes narrowing. She thought of all the people she'd spoken to, all the stories that needed to be told. She knew what was at stake. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's bring them down." That night, Melanie and Jamal worked late into the evening, finalizing the article that would expose O'Connor and the network of corruption protecting him. As the newsroom buzzed around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Around midnight, there was a knock on the office door. Jamal glanced at her, and they both knew this wasn't good. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the door. But Melanie wasn't about to hide. She followed him, her heart hammering in her chest. As he opened the door, two men stood outside. One of them was the same scar-faced man from the diner, a menacing grin spreading across his face. "Evening, folks. We'd like to have a word with Miss Jackson." Melanie stepped forward, her chin held high. "You want to talk?" "Talk," the man chuckled, stepping into the room. "Oh, we'll talk, but not here. You're coming with us." Jamal stepped between them. "Not a chance. If you've got something to say, you can say it here." The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "This isn't a request, buddy. You're coming too, if you don't want to end up in a cell tonight." Melanie's breath caught in her throat. She knew this was it, the moment where everything could go horribly wrong. But she also knew she couldn't let fear control her. "Fine," she said. "But if you think I'm going anywhere without my phone recording every second, you're dead wrong." The man's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Have it your way." They were escorted out to the dark SUV, where they were forced into the back seats. The ride was tense and silent, every second stretching into an eternity. Melanie kept her phone discreetly streaming live, knowing that every word, every threat would be documented. When they finally arrived, they were taken to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a single light bulb flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the concrete floor. O'Connor was there, leaning against a metal table, his expression dark. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you, Jackson?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Melanie didn't flinch. "I'm not the one hiding in a warehouse, Officer O'Connor. If you have something to say, say it." He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think people care about your little crusade. All you're doing is stirring up trouble, and I'm here to put an end to it." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "You can't silence the truth, O'Connor. Not anymore." O'Connor's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, she thought he might strike her. But then, in the distance, the faint sound of sirens cut through the night. His eyes widened, and he turned to the scar-faced man. "What the hell is that?" Jamal, still recording on his phone, couldn't help but smile. "Looks like you're out of time, officer." O'Connor's men panicked, scrambling for the exits. But it was too late. The police, alerted by Jamal's live stream, were closing in. Melanie's heart pounded as the warehouse was suddenly flooded with flashing lights and the sound of boots on concrete. "Drop your weapons," a voice shouted. "You're all under arrest." O'Connor's face twisted into a mask of rage and fear. He knew it was over. "This isn't over, Jackson," he shouted, even as he was forced to his knees, his hands cuffed behind his back. Melanie watched as he was led away, a sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't over, but it was a start, and she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The events at the warehouse rippled through the city like a shockwave. News stations ran the footage captured by Jamal and Melanie, showing Officer O'Connor's violent outburst and the desperate attempts of his men to silence the truth. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. For many, it was the confirmation of what they had long suspected, but had been too afraid to say out loud. Systemic corruption and racial bias were deeply embedded in the city's police force. Melanie knew she had struck a nerve, but the victory felt fragile. Sitting in her small apartment, she scrolled through the flood of messages on social media. Some praised her courage, while others spewed venomous hate, calling her a liar, a troublemaker, or worse. She had been in this position before, but never with stakes so high. She had ruffled the feathers of a very dangerous bird, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it tried to strike back. The following morning, she arrived at the newspaper office to find the place buzzing with energy. Her colleagues greeted her with nods of respect, some patting her on the back. She felt a swell of pride, but also a pang of anxiety. She spotted Jamal near the break room, talking with a man in a suit, a lawyer by the looks of it. "Hey, Mel," Jamal said as she approached. "This is Arthur Reynolds, our legal counsel." Arthur extended his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Jackson. I've been following your work closely. We need to talk about the next steps." Melanie shook his hand and nodded. "I figured as much. What's the plan?" Arthur gestured for them to follow him to a conference room. "We've got a solid case against O'Connor and his men, thanks to your recordings and testimonies from the victims. But you should know, this is going to get ugly. They've already hired a team of top defense attorneys, and they're going to come after you hard. Character assassination, counterclaims, you name it." Melanie folded her arms, her expression resolute. "Let them try. I'm not backing down." Arthur smiled, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Good. That's what I was hoping to hear. But you'll need to be prepared for anything. They'll likely try to discredit your work, dig up anything from your past they can use against you. We need to be one step ahead." Jamal chimed in. "And we need to keep pushing the story, Mel. Keep the pressure on. If we let this die down, they'll find a way to bury it." Melanie nodded. "I'm ready. Let's make sure they don't get the chance." Over the next few weeks, the city became a battleground. Protests erupted, with citizens demanding justice and accountability from the police department. Many rallied around Melanie, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Silence is complicity." At the same time, there were counter-protests, groups waving flags and chanting in support of the police, accusing Melanie of inciting hatred and division. The police department, under intense scrutiny, was forced to take action. O'Connor and several of his men were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The chief of police, a man known for his hardline stance, reluctantly held a press conference, attempting to reassure the public that justice would be served. But Melanie knew it was a show, a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation spiraling out of their grasp. As the days went by, Melanie found herself at the center of a storm. Her apartment became a target, strange cars parked outside, and she often felt eyes watching her every move. She began receiving ominous packages, an empty bullet casing, a blood-stained rag, threatening notes. The police, unsurprisingly, did little to investigate these threats. One night, as she was returning home from another late shift at the newsroom, she noticed a figure lingering near her building's entrance. She slowed her pace, her heart thudding in her chest. The figure turned, and she caught a glimpse of his face, scarred, menacing. It was the same man from the diner and the warehouse. Melanie's instincts kicked in, and she quickly ducked into a nearby alley, pulling out her phone to call Jamal. "Jamal, he's here. The scar-faced guy from O'Connor's crew. He's watching my building." "Stay where you are," Jamal said urgently. "I'm sending someone to get you. Don't go anywhere." She stayed hidden in the shadows, her breath shallow, eyes darting back to the street. Minutes felt like hours until she saw a familiar car pull up. Jamal's. He had brought Arthur and another colleague with him. They quickly got her into the car and sped away, leaving the shadowy figure behind. "We're going to have to find you a safer place to stay," Arthur said, his tone grave. "They're getting desperate, and desperate people do stupid things." Melanie nodded, her adrenaline still coursing. "I'm not going to live in fear," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "But I won't be reckless either. Let's do what we need to." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. Arthur had set up a safe house for Melanie, and Jamal ensured she was always accompanied by someone from the team. Despite the heightened security, Melanie continued her work, determined to see it through. She met with community leaders, civil rights advocates, and local politicians who had been galvanized by her story. They formed a coalition, demanding a full-scale investigation, not just into O'Connor, but into the entire department. Melanie knew she had to keep the momentum going. She started organizing town hall meetings, inviting victims to speak out publicly, giving them a platform to share their experiences. One such meeting drew hundreds of people, filling the local community center to capacity. Melanie stood at the front, microphone in hand, as one by one, people came forward to share their stories. Stories of harassment, false arrests, beatings, and a system that had failed them at every turn. A young woman, tears streaming down her face, spoke of her brother, who had been shot by police during a traffic stop. "They said he reached for something, but he was unarmed," she sobbed. "They took him from us, and all they gave us were lies." The room erupted in applause and shouts of support, and Melanie felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. This was why she did what she did. Not for fame, not for glory, but to give voice to the voiceless, to shine a light in the darkest corners. But the opposition was just as fierce. Outside the community center, a group of counter-protesters had gathered, waving flags and signs that read, "Back the Blue" and "Stop the Lies." Tensions ran high, and Melanie knew that at any moment, things could turn violent. Jamal had arranged for additional security, and as the meeting ended, he quickly ushered Melanie out the back, away from the growing crowd. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "They're not going to back down." Melanie nodded. "Neither are we." The day of the court hearing arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by a sea of protesters, both for and against Melanie's cause. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Melanie sat with Jamal and Arthur at the plaintiff's table, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. O'Connor entered the courtroom, flanked by his high-priced lawyers. He looked defiant, confident that his money and connections would see him through. Melanie could see the disdain in his eyes as he glanced her way, a smirk playing on his lips. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Arthur presented the evidence: Jamal's recordings, testimonies from victims, and a damning paper trail that linked O'Connor to a history of misconduct and corruption. The defense team fired back, attacking Melanie's credibility, painting her as a radical out to destroy good officers' lives for a sensational story. As the hours passed, Melanie felt the emotional toll weighing on her. The defense's arguments were brutal, aiming to discredit her at every turn, but she remained resolute, knowing the truth was on her side. When it was her turn to testify, she stood tall, recounting everything she had seen and heard, every threat, every moment of fear. She spoke not just for herself, but for all the victims who had come forward, and those who hadn't yet found the courage. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent. She looked at the jury, their faces a mix of empathy and uncertainty. She knew she had to trust in them, trust that they would see through the smoke and mirrors of the defense's tactics. As the judge called for a recess, Melanie stepped outside for some air, her nerves frayed. Jamal joined her, his expression serious. "You did great in there, Mel. Whatever happens, you've done more than anyone ever expected." She nodded, feeling both exhausted and strangely at peace. "Thanks, Jamal. Whatever happens, we've come this far. That means something." After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the judge asked for silence. "We find the defendant, Brian O'Connor, guilty on all counts." A gasp ran through the room, followed by cheers from Melanie's supporters. Tears filled her eyes as she realized what this meant, not just for her, but for everyone who had fought beside her. Justice, for once, had prevailed. Outside, the crowd erupted in celebration. Melanie stood on the steps of the courthouse, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. She spotted Jamal in the crowd, and he made his way over to her, a broad smile on his face. "You did it, Mel." "We did it," she nodded, smiling through her tears. "This is just the beginning, Jamal. There's so much more work to do," he laughed, nodding, "and I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." As she looked out over the crowd, Melanie felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger for it. And she knew she would keep fighting, keep speaking up, because there were still so many stories that needed to be told.